Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Lewin. I'm the CEO of the Computer History Museum. I hope everyone is well and safe during these difficult times. Today, I'm pleased to welcome you to our event. It's just going to be stunningly fun. Veteran Silicon Valley journalist Mike Malone is going to share his stories and insights on how Silicon Valley and the tech sector began, the connections between the history and the issues of the day. We couldn't be more pleased to be hosting this program today. It speaks directly to the mission of the institution, which is about computing, but it's mostly about the people. Our programs are made possible through the generosity and through the members and donors who support our institution. And your support today is much appreciated. You can go to our website and help us deliver on our mission, which is to decode technology for everyone, the computing past, the digital present, and the future impact on humanity. And here today to introduce the program and the speakers is Marguerite Gong Hancock, the museum's VP of Innovation and Programming. Marguerite?
Thanks so much, Daniel. I'm just delighted to add my welcome to each of you to today's virtual program, part of a series we launched at the beginning of the pandemic in spring of 2020. And today I'm really excited to share some good news. CHM will be reopening our physical doors here in Silicon Valley to the public on September 1st. So be sure to explore our website and subscribe to our email list so you won't miss this fall's exciting lineup of virtual, hybrid, and yes, once again, in-person programming this fall. And now for today's program. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to go back in time to relive history and benefit from its lessons to shape the future? Well, today we have that unusual opportunity. In 1985, Mike Malone, one of the first reporters of the tech industry beat at the San Jose Mercury News, chronicled how Silicon Valley began, a decades-long story of people and companies. His book, The Big Score, recounts the history of the tech sector from its upstart beginnings. At the time, it was really influential as a compelling account, not only of the meteoric rise of the valley, but also it proved to be a draw for aspiring entrepreneurs. As Jeff Skoll, the first president of eBay and now social entrepreneur, says, Mike Malone's stories captured the essence of Valley culture and the many outsized personalities who helped create this mecca of tech. Malone's epic depiction of Silicon Valley, The Big Score, was a calling card for me and countless other young entrepreneurs with a background in tech. Now a new edition of The Big Score, the billion-dollar story of Silicon Valley, is being published by Stripe Press. We're really pleased to partner with the press as well as Mike Malone and NBC reporter Scott Budman for today's conversation. Mike offers a unique perspective because he was here capturing contemporary history through firsthand experience. As Mike writes, later historians would use the internet or newly created tech history archives to build their narratives, but I was there. I know how the air smelled when half the valley was still covered in blooming fruit trees. I can remember Bob Noyce's baritone voice and what it was like to shake David Packard's enormous hand, to see little Steve Jobs on my elementary school playground, and to play the first Atari game machine at Andy Capp's pub. So at a time when tech companies' influence continues to grow and is hotly debated about positive and negative effects, we're at a critical juncture for Silicon Valley, one that would benefit from a long view. As a chronicler of the Valley from those early days to today, when he hosts a weekly podcast, Mike brings exactly that kind of perspective to today's conversation. He'll address questions such as, what's one of the forgotten stories from the early years of Silicon Valley that would be valuable for us to learn from today? What are connections between the Valley's history with pressing issues today and its future trajectory? What about the Valley's darker side that's evolved and what most concerns you today? So we're very pleased to be hosting this event in collaboration with Stripe Press, as I mentioned, connected to fintech company Stripe, one of the Valley's highest valued private companies. The press publishes books about economic and technological advancement. So as a CHM tradition, I'll introduce our speaker using 5 numbers. Michael S. Malone is an author, television producer, and the Dean's Executive Professor at Santa Clara University. Here are his 5 numbers. 1963, the year he arrived in Silicon Valley. 29, the age when he finished writing The Big Score. 800, the number of pages in the first draft of The Big Score. 25, pay in cents earned per hour to write The Big Score. And 25, the number of books written, including Bill and Dave and Intel Trinity. Now, to moderate today's conversation, we're really thrilled to feature on the CHM stage Scott Budman. Scott's an Emmy Award-winning reporter for NBC Bay Area, where he reports on business and technology. Scott is also Mike's podcast partner for the Silicon Valley Insider, a weekly overview of Silicon Valley and the tech industry. Scott holds a degree in political science from UCLA. Welcome, Mike and Scott. We're so looking forward to your conversation. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Marguerite. Welcome to everyone. And Michael, welcome to you.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, it is great to talk to you. And this time I get to ask you the questions. So
yes.
That's kind of a switch.
and folks, please allow this to be a little bit informal. Scott and I aren't really capable of anything else.
This is an honor to be here for many reasons. Mike, you know I'm a big fan of yours. And as a tech reporter, I've been standing on your shoulders for years. But also the Computer History Museum. Some of the earliest stories I did as a Silicon Valley reporter were at CHM. And you've allowed me to host programming there, to do many interviews there, and to just sort of geek out both individually and with young children to sort of see the exhibits. And I've always appreciated that. So it's an honor to be associated with that. Mike,
Scott, if I can add, I'm deeply honored. I've done many things at the museum over the years. I go back so far. I remember when Gordon and Gwen Bell were making the decision to move to Silicon Valley, and even further back on the land where the museum is now. As a 10-year-old, I used to use my BB gun to hunt ground squirrels. So, it's a great honor, and I'm really thrilled at what Daniel's doing with the museum right now and moving it into the future and repositioning. I think that's just tremendous and needed right now.
Excellent. Well, everything you just said referenced both the past and the present and the future, and that's what we're going to get into. I love technology, obviously. I love Silicon Valley. I love history, and I'm not ashamed to say I love the 80s. And we're going to get into a lot of these today. It's fitting, Mike. First of all, we're doing this on one of those days when people say, what were you doing when? Because after all, in 1969, this is when we landed on the moon.
Yes.
And it was, for many of us, literally a lifetime ago. Going back to 1985 in Silicon Valley terms, wouldn't you agree that that's kind of going back maybe 3 or 4 lifetimes, given how fast the pace of technology changes? And yet, we're going to go into your predictions and everything, but I was taken when I went back and reread some of this stuff with how similar a lot of stuff is.
Yes.
Are you thinking, hey, that the more things change, the more they kind of stay the same?
Well, if you follow Moore's law, we've been through about 10 lifetimes since I wrote the book. No, I find myself at this point in my life driving down El Camino or heading out to Computer History Museum, and I'm flashing between multiple periods of time. That where the Computer History Museum is and where Facebook is and where Google are were farm fields. I can remember that. I can remember when, NASA was adding more buildings out there. Then I saw the, Shoreline, Steve, Wozniak building the amphitheater. And everything all seems to be in here simultaneously, the past and the present. And the Valley is kind of the same way. It hasn't changed in fundamental ways, but it has changed completely. That it's a very, very different place, producing very, very different products and services. And yet some of the characteristics of the Valley still survive. It's still that same hard-driving entrepreneurial community. And instead of meeting in Denny's, they're meeting in Pete's to
Right.
plot the creation of new companies. But they're still plotting the creation of new companies.
It struck me that the rock stars of the time of the book were the chip executives, and the big
Yes.
industry at the time was the chip industry. And that lasted for quite some time. And then there was quite a period of time when chips were sort of on the back burner. They were everywhere, but they weren't as sexy. The executives weren't getting all the press. So let's fast forward all the way to the past, literally just a couple of months. All of a sudden, there's a huge chip shortage. We're talking about not only iPhones, but automobiles. Everything is so dependent on chips. It's now front page news. You know, driverless cars, everybody needs chips. All of a sudden, I'm thinking, you must be having deja vu because all of a sudden the chip industry is front and center again.
No, you can't get an F-150 right now, the most popular vehicle in the United States, because they can't get the chips and microprocessors for the engine computer. That tells you something very profound and something we forget, because we're now, on the food chain of Silicon Valley, we're about 7 levels down, doing apps and that sort of thing, driverless cars. But at the very top of that pyramid are chips. The semiconductor, there's a reason it's called Silicon Valley, even though we don't make any silicon here anymore. Chips matter because everything flows from them. And we get excited about the latest new technologies and products and companies. But in the end, it all depends on getting those chips built. And right now, they haven't been getting built.
Right. And it makes sense to see, for different reasons, Zoom stock at all-time highs or near it, Facebook stock near all-time highs. But so are applied materials. Look at NVIDIA, look at Qualcomm. Chips are kind of sexy again. Did you imagine that, 35 years ago? And could you imagine that what we're talking about today is hot again 35 years from now, given how quickly everything in the Valley changes?
No, because chips got embedded. And once they really got embedded, and then once you piled software on top of it, operating systems and software, and then apps and everything else, the chips are so hidden away. The last time we thought about chips when they said Intel Inside, the great marketing campaign. Now we're realizing everything depends upon it. For want of a nail, the battle's lost. And without semiconductors, we're in those straits right now. And it's a very dangerous time because 80% of the world's chips were being made in Taiwan, and China's making rather rude noises towards Taiwan. They have found the choke point of the world economy, and it's right there in those fabs. And there's a scramble right now by Intel and even by, the Taiwanese to get over to the States and start creating fabs. But that's going to take 2 or 3 years and billions of dollars to get us up to the point that we're secure again, that we're making our own semiconductor devices. So this is a very worrisome time right now.
I wanted to ask, since you brought it up, the sort of geopolitical situation now and technology are so entwined, just like politics on Capitol Hill and technology are so entwined. It seems every other week there's an antitrust hearing or something. It's all together a very incestuous world between global politics and Silicon Valley tech. What was it like in 1985? Weren't we a little more, I don't want to say in the shadows, but sort of doing our own thing back then?
Unnoticed would be probably the right word to describe it. I mean, this was a world of concrete tilled-up buildings in the middle of orchards. And, very few freeways. El Camino was the main artery. And during that time, the Valley operated pretty much independently of the rest of the United States. There were no famous people in 1985. I mean, Jobs was in his little building on Bub Road, and Noyce hadn't gotten his great profile by Tom Wolfe yet in Esquire magazine. The Valley wasn't noticed. They were doing extraordinary things, but we were still relatively anonymous, operating independently of the influence of Washington, D.C., and pretty much setting our own rules. I mean, it was even greater if you go back another decade when Don Heffler named the town Silicon Valley. He had to actually introduce this area to readers of electronic news. I mean, everybody knew HP had been here since the 30s, but for the most part, this wasn't seen as an enclave of high technology. It was just starting to be. I mean, keep in mind, the book was published, I think, a week before. I finished the book a week before Apple introduced the Macintosh. So Apple was, the Apple II was pretty well known, but the Apple III had been a disaster. Lisa, which was supposed to change the world, was not a big deal, it turned out. So the world would change a week after I finished this book, which I think is the fate of most historians, especially contemporary historians. You finish something, wrap it all up, and then it's all obsolete the next week.
Right. And even with Apple revolutionizing the computer game, they still struggled along, remember, with a very small market share for decades, really. I mean, they were
Oh,
sort
yeah.
of, hey, if you're kind of hip in, California, and maybe you have one of these machines, but not everybody does. What was the turning point? I remember in the late 90s, it was the stock market that really brought everybody to Silicon Valley. But was there a turning point before that where we removed the tech industry from the shadows into the light? Was it just the Mac, or was there more of a gradual move?
I don't think it was the Mac, because the Mac did not get a real strong reception. I mean, they've made movies about it now, but when it was introduced at Flint Center, I was there. And it was a big deal, but it wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, there were a lot of questions about it. I mean, a mouse,
Right.
and the tiny screen, it didn't have enough memory, and what are you going to use it for, which really didn't get fixed until Adobe came along. Um, no, I think the two turning points were, one, Apple going public, the Apple IPO, and everyone talked about that. Uh, it made a bunch of people that otherwise would have never been that successful really wealthy. I mean, Apple at the time, you gave out founder stock like it was jelly beans. And there's all restrictions on that kind of stuff now, but back then a lot of people were made millionaires overnight, like secretaries and the guy who watered the office plants and that sort of thing. And it suddenly realized, oh my goodness, this technology is hot, it's going to be worth a lot of money, and we can all get in on it. I think that, and to the point that I had people in the newsroom at the Mercury News sidling up to me in the hallways going, hey, can you get me some founder stock in Apple? And I said, well, I believe that's against the law. But, the second event I think occurred, you know, right about the time I was writing this book. And that was the Japanese. The Japanese came rolling in with chips that were better than ours. And I was at that event where the guy from HP showed quality charts of Silicon Valley chips versus Japanese chips. And it was an eye opener. It was astounding. The Japanese stuff was so much better, cheaper, more reliable, and everything else. And the Valley was just knocked on its rear end. And that was when Bob Noyce went back to DC and started doing congressional testimony and all that. And he became the face of Silicon Valley. And the whole Japanese battle with Japan and all that lasted for a few years really it had two effects. It put Silicon Valley really on the map as a crucial part of the American economy and our competitiveness. But it also started what I think has been a not a pleasant history of the Valley dealing with Washington, D.C., dealing with the feds. I mean, it's inevitable now because they're so big. They're the biggest companies in the history of the world. But back then, they really dreaded having to do it. And if you remember, David Packard had come back a few years before that from being Deputy Secretary of Defense. And he said, never again. Never going to Washington again. We're not even going to do defense contracts. They can buy off the shelf. He was so bitter by the experience. That was the attitude of the Valley. After that, now we have people running for office and making maybe the critical contributions to candidates. I mean, the Valley is interlocked with DC now, and there's no getting away from it. And it's just going to get deeper and deeper.
Yeah, we'll get into that too. You mentioned the money and the sort of spotlight that shined because of the Apple IPO, and it brings up two things. One, I remember shortly after that IPO, Steve Jobs attained, rock star status. And part of that was almost this sort of super casual, hippie, almost poverty-stricken look. He would pose on magazine covers barefoot, which for a long time in America was a sign that times were tough. Fast forward a bit to what I would say perhaps the second most influential IPO in Silicon Valley was Netscape. And after they went public, another spotlight on Mark Andreessen, who's on the cover of Time magazine, barefoot again. We ushered in not only the rock star CEO, but sort of the casual rock star CEO.
Right.
I mean, by the time you published your book, did anyone dress the way you're dressing right now? I mean, honestly, in terms of executives, because we became not only the place where money was and all this sexy technology, but also the place where we dressed
Yes.
casually, right?
In fact, I named one of the chapters in the book T-shirt tycoons because they were such a new phenomenon. And there was always a great disconnect between the look and the reality because these were hard charging people, and I sat in with uh, Jobs and during the infamous 1984 annual report. And he really did go wash his feet in the toilet. I mean, he massaged his feet by flushing the toilet with his feet in it. And I thought, well, okay, that's interesting. But the guy sitting at the table across from me was a hard-charging, ambitious, driven guy, as just like everybody else leading Silicon Valley. He just had a costume and that fit with him, and it was basically a statement that I'm not one of them. I'm not of that generation. We're the new crowd, and we will dress and behave the way we want. And it was as much a message as his lifestyle. And obviously, it's been copied ever since, up until the '90s, when all of a sudden everything switched to jeans and black T-shirts.
Good point. I just want to read one comment. And by the way, we will take questions from you guys in a little bit. But Mike, this is very timely from John Massey, who says, hey, don't knock the 128K Mac. We used Mac Project on mine to schedule MIPS, right? Remember MIPS development.
Oh, I know John Massey is. Yeah. Hi, John.
And I love that reference. And yeah, right. I mean, this was important technology. It just hadn't hit the mainstream quite yet, right?
Yeah. Yeah, MIPS interesting story because I went in my next book after this. I went inside of MIPS for a couple months, following them on their IPO, and I learned so much about human nature, and how people's lives change and everything else. And that's kind of, IPOs are again the emblematic event of Silicon Valley. For a long time, every business plan said at the end, and then we'll sell to Google. But in the last few years, with IPOs taking off again, it's become IPO Valley once more, and that's fun because I think it's democratizing, and people get to participate in that process of creation and making wealth. And I think that, as much as entrepreneurship, is the heart of the Valley.
Well, it almost seemed like for a while there, not only were startups keeping money to be these multi-billion-dollar, unicorns, as they'd call them, but would rather get bought up. If you were a chip company, you were looking to, perhaps an Intel to buy you. If you were a social media company or an Instagram, you were thinking, hey, Facebook's going to come in and give us $1 billion, a la YouTube and Google. But then you're right, we started to see more IPOs. Is that, as a journalist, I like to see that because they're independent.
Yes.
I remember when Microsoft made that bid for Yahoo many years ago, thinking, well, that would be sad if Yahoo goes away because they're absorbed by another giant company. Right. They ended up going away for different reasons. But
the big companies were making themselves immortal by doing M&A. Your Facebook, and you're starting to lose some of your billion users. So what do? You buy the next hot company, and you just keep going that way, buying up all those users and staying perpetually young. So now you got WhatsApp and, et cetera. And that, I don't think that's healthy for the Valley. Companies need to die. Most of the companies in the big score are gone. There are a few residual survivors, but that was a good thing, because we constantly need to refresh with new talent, new companies, new ideas, et cetera. And if we're just going to have a handful of gigantic companies that absorb everything that poses a potential threat, this isn't the Valley anymore.
Because of social media, since you mentioned Facebook, these days, a lot of young techies, especially the founders, complain to me that, because of social media, everybody knows everything about us. Everyone's looking for the dark side of success, a la, hey, Jeff Bezos may be a multi-billionaire who's going into space, but look at those workers. They are urinating in bottles when they drive their truck. So there's always that two sides, which again is what we do for our jobs. Back in the 80s, there's this perception that people didn't know about that. But in your book, you talk about how there was a dark side. There wasn't social media at the time, but we kind of knew that there was some shenanigans going on, right?
Yeah, well, when I went back and looked over the book again when I was editing it for Stripe, I was struck that I thought that I was going to be reading this cheerleading book for the Valley. Oh, isn't it great? It's the future and all these wonderful human beings changing the world and all that. And then I find that, oh yeah, I did work with Susan Yoakum and do the 4-part series on toxic chemicals killing people in the Valley. And with Pete Carey, we looked into espionage and drugs and everything else. There were criminals running around the Valley, even back in the 70s when the chip shortage happened in the early 80s, the DRAM chip shortage. We had the Black Gorilla family working in here in the Valley trying to, get chips off of loading docks, even bad ones, so they could sell them on the gray market. And now we know that there have been spies here almost from the beginning, and not just our enemies, but our allies are here as well. That was a shocker to me, and to reread that there's a whole second valley that's kind of hidden underneath the first one, and in many ways, I think that kind of criminality has actually reduced over the last 30, 40 years. I think high-end criminality is probably in the ascendant right now. And why be a criminal when you can you can make $1 billion, pretty easily around here?
Is it different because so much of the technology decades ago was sort of built on the government infrastructure? I mean, the chip industry to help the defense industry. And now it's, hey, we've got 400 different apps to help you date, or
Right.
get your food delivered. It's a different world. And so you're right. It seems like that end goal isn't government espionage or anything, although, Palantir is now, and certainly Facebook is got its share of detractors. But the goal seems to be, hey, let's do something, cash in, and sort of move on.
Yeah, I think the good news, the Valley had a fundamental shift between hardware and software, okay, and between electrical engineers and code writers. And that's the old world. That's as I think back about Fairchild and those companies in the early days, the Intels and the Nationals and all that, that was very much a madman kind of era, And you look at it, and Andy Grove's got a crew cut in the old photographs and that sort of thing, and you realize that was a distinct world, and that kind of world did have, traditional criminal behavior. It had companies where they dreamed of becoming big, and they had very specific structures, organizational charts, and everything else. Software changes everything. And I think the market changes too, because originally the Valley was selling to industry. It was a commercial Valley. We were selling to other companies. Now, the turning point was the web, but then social networks. The Valley sells to consumers now. And it's a different world view. Old Valley, families buy your home, live in the Valley, get your gold watch. Today, young people, San Francisco, and you sold on specs in the hardware era. You sell on, in many ways, manipulation in the software, the social networking era. Those companies are really thinking about how to enlist you, Mr. Consumer, Mrs. Consumer, into joining our world, becoming a member of our, I don't want to say cult, but yeah, cult, and they use tricks from casinos and everything else. They even convinced us to design our own products. What is Facebook but a set of tools to make us workers for ourselves? That's a very different reality, and it's begun to show in the personality of the Valley.
Were there any companies or even entire industries back then sort of jumping on the tech bandwagon where clearly they weren't tech, but they wanted either a tech valuation or that sort of sexy aura? In other words, was there a WeWork back in the 80s that was trying to jump on and say, hey, we're a tech company?
Well, there's a little bit of that. They began to show kind of techie ads. you know, that they really weren't, but they were trying to affiliate them. They were trying to affiliate themselves with the cool valley thing. So you got that's the commercials. You look at ads from the 60s and the 70s. It's all people dressed like me, and they got the pretty girl sitting at a computer that she's never seen before in her life, and it's very sexist stuff and everything else. Um, and then in the 70s, you start to see the change. You start seeing nerds appearing in advertising. And the whole point of showing a nerd was we have a nerd. So we're actually a tech company and we're smart too. And we're hard driving and we're going to be really successful because we have this guy. And that was kind of the turning point, the point of inflection.
You had mentioned the term Silicon Valley coming up, and it's stuck. I mean, like, that's incredible branding. And I want to bring up just a quick comment from Mark Robichek in the audience. Mark, thanks for writing. If you believe certain publications, and this comes up, it seems every month, Silicon Valley has lost its luster. Not only that, other cities are emerging as rivals, as other tech centers, thinking of Austin, Boston, Tel Aviv, et cetera, all around the world. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, Silicon Valley has had a pretty incredible run.
Yes.
And I've always thought that the other cities are, the most flattering thing we could see. But is it competition that's taking away from what we have?
Well, I'm kind of ambivalent about that because I declared the valley dead about 4 times over the years.
We're going to get into your predictions too. Yeah.
And I was wrong every single time. Has the valley lost its luster? I think the traditional valley has lost its luster. But, think about it. If you really look at this valley carefully, its tech history goes back 121 years. It goes back to Lee DeForest and Cy Elwell in Palo Alto. It wasn't, the valley, but it was on the cutting edge of technology. And by the time you get to Bill and Dave in the garage, the valley's already 30 years old. And that was 90 years ago. And the valley's still going strong because the valley keeps regenerating itself. And I declare the valley dead because of traffic, because of the cost of housing. And I look back and I go, there wasn't that much traffic when I said the traffic was terrible. And you could buy a house, in Sunnyvale. You could buy an Eichler in Sunnyvale for $90,000. So what was I complaining about? I mean, the valley seems to have the ability to rise above all of these peripheral challenges as long as that entrepreneurial core and company building and creativity stays strong. That's why I worry about these giant companies having too much control, because we begin to age then. We lose that vitality of people, wanting to reach for the brass ring. I think the valley will regenerate itself again. I mean, I've been to all of these other silicon enclaves, and yeah, they have tech companies, they have some entrepreneurs, but they don't have the culture. This is the only place I've ever been where technology is just interpenetrated with the culture. It's inextricable. You go to the Century Theater, and they're doing ads for we need programmers, during a kids movie, and you
Right.
go to the local coffee place, and there's, especially during booms like when people were developing apps for the iPhone, there was 6 or 7 tables in my Cupertino Pete's with little groups of people surrounding a laptop with a spreadsheet on it, and they were starting a company. I don't go anywhere where I see that. And finally, look at venture capital. Where is all the tech venture capital in the world located? Sand Hill Road. I mean, they have offices everywhere, but it's right here. And as long as the money's here, Silicon Valley will keep regenerating itself.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly haven't gotten rid of traffic or high housing costs. And my concern is, as those get higher and higher, it's one thing to say, hey, you're already here, you've got your house, okay, the commute is a bit of a pain, but what about young people who traditionally start startups, creating value, going to Sand Hill Road to, kiss the ring and get that VC money?
Right.
If we scare them away, not so much because of traffic, but because of high housing costs, I mean, because of the age of my children, I know a lot of high schoolers and people thinking about college,
Right.
and they're thinking, how could I ever come back to the Bay Area when I'm in my early 20s as a graduate, because there's no way we're going to afford housing. And I don't really have an argument for that. And I'm worried that that set of entrepreneurs are going to go somewhere else, costing us a whole lot of future startups.
Right. And I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal a while back where I kind of suggested what could happen. It's begun to happen, but it's been very slow. And that is the valley has to grow outwards. You know, it kind of went over the hill towards Santa Cruz with Seagate and all that years ago. But now I'm hearing developers are really starting to develop Morgan Hill. And once they get a highway, a real highway through Hollister, and then going east, Tracy's a beautiful little town. It's just over the hill. You know, we can grow in all those directions physically, and obviously we're growing tall. I mean, I drive down El Camino in Sunnyvale. I don't know where I am. I mean, I'm in a canyon of 6-story tall buildings, the length of the city. That's going to happen too. It's going to go up. It has to. So it gets more urbanized. Will that defeat the valley? I don't know. I mean, I think the COVID lockdown was interesting because we've learned that, yeah, people can be productive doing a Zoom call. And I think that will enable the valley to become more virtualized. I mean, physically, it's going to stay around the Bay Area, but I think it can virtualize well out into all of Northern California.
That's a good point. I mean, that's been a subject we've tackled on your podcast, where the Valley for decades has flirted with the idea of, hey, we do technology, especially software, and therefore we can work from home or from a Pete's coffee shop. It's never really been tested until the last 12, 14 months. And wow, if you look at productivity, product, releases, stock prices, it seems to have worked really well. Correct.
But you're beginning to see a little backlash. Some of the companies are saying, oh, wait a minute. I think we went too far. And I think that's a matter of they're losing control. That's what they fear.
Well, Apple didn't build that spaceship so you could sit there in front of your bookshelf and talk on it.
Yeah. California talked about that high-speed rail and from north to south. And I thought the best thing they could do right now would be to build a high-speed rail from San Francisco or San Jose to Sacramento and open up the I-80 corridor to the valley for it to grow. I don't think we need to drive to the office every day anymore. I think even the companies that want their employees to come back are saying, hey, 2 days a week, we'll negotiate. 3 days a week, just don't quit. I think that's the future.
Yeah, because you're right. It did seem to work. So let's go back a bit. So in the foreword for your book, you wrote a new foreword, and you talk about what you did and did not get right from 1985. And yeah, I mean, you called the Valley dead many times, but let's talk about some of the specific things that stick out to you.
That I screwed up?
Well, sure. Why
Absolutely. The one I feel most guilty about is Doug Engelbart, because when I was working the
mouse,
yes, I mean he did everything. The demo of demos. He gave us basically everything we're looking at right now. The mouse, the screen, the bit mapping, everything else. He had been pretty much forgotten. I as a kid I had seen a clip of that stuff. Xerox PARC, I think, showed it of Engelbart doing the demo of all demos, and I had forgotten about him. The Valley had pretty much forgotten about him. And he came into the Mercury News one day and sat down and talked to me and tried to, just tell me what he was doing and what he had done and all that. And I just thought he was just another old Valley guy, living in the past. And I didn't give him enough credit. And when I wrote this book, I didn't give him enough credit. I bought the PR lines being put out by, Apple and the other computer companies, that they were the creators of this stuff. And unfortunately, Doug got Alzheimer's disease, fairly young. I saw him a couple of times, but I was never really able to apologize to him for not giving him the credit. Luckily, history has begun to give him some credit. I don't think enough, but it's begun. And the second thing I screwed up on, and there's no forgiving me for this one, the internet. Now, I was with a group of kids. They were we were bright kids and they were studying us, and they took us on trips, field trips. We went to Xerox PARC. I sat down in front of a terminal, and I got to play with ARPANET in 1967, 68, somewhere in there, and it did absolutely nothing for me. I mean, you had to type in all of these code numbers just to talk to some guy at Caltech who I didn't know. I had nothing to say to him. And I thought, this is stupid. This is never going to go anywhere. And then when the with the well and the web started taking off, the internet started taking off, and the web and everything else, I tried that. And I thought, okay, well, that's kind of interesting, but nothing I'm going to devote my time to. And it wasn't until really the web came along, the World Wide Web, when everybody else found out, that I finally thought, oh, this isn't bad. I may use it on a regular basis. So you will not see the word internet in a book written in published in 1985, even though we were right on the cusp of, changing everything. So I regret that one.
Well, I'd say that your former classmate Steve Jobs had a slightly different experience when he visited Xerox PARC.
Oh yeah.
So.
Well, well, I got to tell you, one of the things you know this is at least as much as I do, because you're still out there in the field on the lines. But you cover a story, a daily story, and then over the weekend you do the roundup and you discover the real story behind the daily story, and then 6 months later you find out the real story behind the real story behind the real story. And then 10 years later at a cocktail party, someone tells you actually what happened. And, and Steve Jobs at Xerox PARC is a perfect example of that. The famous self-effacing mythological story. He goes into Xerox PARC and he sees Xerox's computer, and it's got all of Engelbart's inventions on it. And he goes, we've got to do that. It's a great story. And it shows Steve's humility and all that. But the fact of the matter is, he was working on Lisa. The Mac team had already gone in there because there were some guys from Xerox PARC that were now working at Apple, and they knew all about this thing. And they said, we got to do it. And they said, well, Steve's got to sign off on it. And they said, he'll never sign off on it because he didn't discover it. And so they decided, let's make him discover it. So they set everything up so he would walk by that computer and go, oh. And so that's the real story. I mean, there's the number of things that I have learned that are in this book are completely wrong. For example, Intel, I didn't realize that Andy Grove had looked at Federico Faggin one day, because Faggin said, I'm going to quit and start Zilog. And Andy said, I will destroy you. They will never hear your name in Silicon Valley again. Okay, so that's why all these years we heard that the microprocessor was Ted Hoff's invention. Now, the architecture of the microprocessor, the idea of the microprocessor was absolutely Ted Hoff's invention, but he stayed at Intel. But when he left, I noticed all of a sudden that the story changed again. Federico disappeared, and yet he's the guy that actually built the damn thing with Shima and Maser. So the real story is these four guys who I nominated two of them for a Nobel Prize. They deserve it. I mean, there are certain people in this town who didn't get Nobel Prizes that deserve it. But that's the real story of the 4004 and the 8008. So the PR departments tend to give credit where it isn't due, and ignore people that deserve the attention. And there's a lot of them.
And you're hard on yourself for missing the internet and what it would turn out to be. But look, many, many years later, Microsoft was still missing the internet.
Yes.
It didn't kill them. They're now the second most valuable.
No, they
company.
killed Netscape in order to survive. Yeah.
Right. And now they're the second most valuable company in the world. There was another company much later than when you wrote your book, on the precipice of going away, to the point where Michael Dell said, let's just sell the assets back to the shareholders. That company is now, by the way, the most valuable company in the world, Apple, which somehow survived thanks largely to the internet and the fact that you can walk around with it everywhere you go.
Well, and the original sin of Apple, I discovered right, when I was writing my Apple book, but that story, doesn't fit with any of our preconceptions. I think, that Steve Jobs convinced Nolan Bushnell to let him design, a computer game, and nobody at Atari believed Steve could do it, and they didn't like him anyway because he was just back from the ashram and he was smelled and he was obnoxious. And so Steve convinced his best friend Steve Wozniak. These guys are both my neighbors. I remember this happening, to design the game. And was working at HP, and he worked all night at Atari getting that first game ready. He gave it to Steve. Steve walked into Bushnell's office, said, "Look what I created." And Bushnell said, "Fabulous." And he paid him. And Steve didn't give half of it to Woz. He gave about a third of it. And because of that, Woz didn't have enough money. When he went to the Westcon Computer Show, he wanted to buy a microprocessor, an early one. And he couldn't afford the 8086 that he wanted from Intel because it was like $400, and he had like $50. So he took one out of a goldfish bowl. They were selling for like $10 a piece, and he built the Apple One around that. And as a result, Apple always had underpowered microprocessors for the first 25 years, and that was the original sin. And Woz didn't find out about it until the plane tour for the Macintosh. And when he found out what had really happened, he was a very upset human being, and I love Woz. I mean, he doesn't deserve to be, upset or ripped off, but that's the original sin of Apple. And now it's the most valuable company in the history of the world,
So yeah, going back to 85, who knew that they would cast that big of a shadow?
They were dying. After IBM PC came out, Apple started losing market share. It was up at high 80s or low 90s before that, and it fell for the next 20 years down to, what was it, 8% before Steve came back with the iMac and all. Yeah.
What company right now is perhaps going to cast the largest shadow? And is there a company out there right now that, we're kind of missing, that maybe 20 years from now we'll say, whoops, we really slept on those guys?
Well, one of the great things about the Valley is you can't predict the next big unicorn. I think, Gordon Moore had a law of batteries too. It doesn't really get noticed because it's not as simple as, the Moore's law of semiconductors. But he always said battery power was going to be the limiting factor on semiconductors at a certain point. There's some battery companies out there that are doing interesting things, and there's just one that went public last week in the Valley, in Novix. Silicon batteries. So now all of a sudden, silicon has come back to Silicon Valley, but in a different guise. Is their product going to work? I don't know, but it's possible that batteries can now get on the freight train, not the rocket ship, of Moore's law of semiconductors. There's other companies that are working crazily about working on batteries too, and I think batteries are going to be crucial. And whoever wins that, whoever has the great breakthrough, I had lunch a little while back with Federico Fugin, and I said, "What's the greatest invention in Valley history?" I said, "Is it DeForest with the triode tube? Is it Shockley, Bardeen, and Brattain with the transistor? Is it Kilby and Noyce with the integrated circuit? Is it you and your team with the microprocessor?" And he said, "No, I think the one true moment of genius in that whole history, Jean Herny and the planar process." He said everything else that we all did, you could see it coming, that it was you were extrapolating from where we are now to what we could do in the future. But he says the idea of taking a transistor and laying it flat in a printing process and being able to scale it down to nanometers with the planar process, he said that came out of the blue. That was not an act of engineering. He said that was an act of artistic creation. And he said everything else, pales next to that moment when Herny came up with that. So I thought that was interesting, and I think that's what we're waiting for. The Valley waits for the moment where you get a planar process and everything changes, and Moore's law presents the opportunity to do that every 2 or 3 years. Okay, everything's cheaper now. I mean, Nolan Bushnell was building, he was a circus barker and he played computer games at his university. And he realized that you couldn't build an electronic pinball machine because there were too many devices, too expensive, and all that. He said the day memory got down below $10, he knew he could build Pong and Space Invaders and start Atari. That constant improvement in performance and reduction in price presents a whole new landscape of opportunity every 3 years, and that's what makes these entrepreneurs keep going. I mean, that opportunity is right there, and I think that great invention is just around the corner, and we can't predict it, we can't depend upon it, but it always shows up, and that's the greatness of the Valley. And I'm waiting to hear the next one. I think it's going to be battery power. I think it could be artificial intelligence. I don't think robotics, but I think we have to still figure out autonomous vehicles in a better way for transportation. Something big is waiting in the wings, and I can just feel it. You can feel it rising underground, but you can't see it yet. So I'm not going to make any, particular predictions.
Let me ask about what might be waiting in the wings on the darker side, because you touch upon this in the book, and you use the phrase "rising from the ground." Many years ago, we figured out what was rising from the ground by the Fairchild plant, and it was killing people ultimately, poisoning their water. We didn't know it then. Nobody really knew it then. Maybe some people, but it sort of caught people by surprise.
Let me tell you a quick anecdote about that.
Sure.
I was sitting at, I was on a story at a big factory was being built, 800,000 square feet, and we were sitting outside having a drink afterwards, me and a bunch of trade press reporters, and I had heard about people getting hurt by toxics, but no one had ever written about it. And I said to the other reporters, I said, do you guys know about toxic chemicals around here? And they said, oh, yeah, it's all over the place. I said, have you ever written about it? They said, no, we're trade press. We write about technology, new products. And I went back to the Merck and I told that to Susan Yoakum, who was a hell of a lot better reporter than I ever was. And we pitched it, and that was the beginning of the whole toxics thing in the Valley. Everybody had quietly known about it, but the Valley was so pretty with the green grass berms and the nice concrete tilled up buildings. This wasn't smokestacks. This wasn't Pittsburgh. We were safe here. It was a clean, safe industry. Only then did we discover that we were working with some of those dangerous chemicals ever known. So. You're right. I think we sense something's wrong, too.
And we sense something is wrong now. And obviously, there are environmental concerns that come from whether it's mining Bitcoin or whatever it is. Right. I mean, there are still smokestack industries. There's still mining going on. But even in the place where, hey, we're clean, we're software, we're not actually producing anything, and therefore we're not hurting the environment, we can see what's coming because of January 6th. We can see what's coming because of 2016, whether it's political or other countries right now that are relying on social media to spread their word. And we're seeing what's already here with entire Facebook sections devoted to why you should not get vaccinated. And we're seeing people die because of it. How long is technology going to be allowed to be a bad guy before A, government figures out what technology does, and B, somebody can act against it and say, hey, there is going to be a disincentive for misinformation, much like eventually there was a disincentive for chemicals coming from your company.
Yeah, I think the toxic threat is not to our bodies, but to our brains right now. We've seen several things occur. One of them is the notion that we can assign people to determine what is truth and then control the access to that truth to billions of people. And I always hearken back to, the Latin phrase about who will guard the guardians. None of us are sure that we are right, and there's a First Amendment specifically designed to create debate between alternative points of view. And if we start censoring heterodox points of view, then we may be missing the solution, to whatever problems we face. And I'm bothered that, we're allowing large companies to decide what we should know. I know you're a little different from me, but I'm a First Amendment absolutist. And, debate is all. All points of view have to be recognized. And it seems as if tech has, in the last decade, begun to narrow the area in which we're allowed to operate in our thinking, in our speech, and everything else. And I'm not sure they're the people that should be doing it. I'm not sure I'm certain the federal government should be doing it, and they're not. To date, they haven't done anything about it because you've seen these. Well, you're covering these congressional testimonies. Our politicians don't even understand what Dorsey and Zuckerberg are talking about. I mean, it's embarrassing. We're starting to see a little bit of a glimmering, and I don't know what the exact solution is. I mean, it's probably somewhere in law, that we've been giving tech special breaks and sparing them responsibility for bad information that they may carry. Something can be done there. I know, we were just talking the other day about how the FTC is, they've sent a warning shot out there. They went after Broadcom on antitrust stuff, and I think that's a hint they're coming for the big boys. We know that the manipulation of video games actually begins to change the wiring of our kids' brains, and ultimately, we have to understand that the digital world is not the same as the natural world, the analog world. The analog world wasn't built for us. We have to learn to cope with it. The digital world was specifically designed for us to entertain us, to manipulate us, to take our money, to empower us, all the good things and bad things on that two-edged sword. And we're still working it out. And, the next few years strike me as rather frightening.
I was going to say, I mean, are we ever going to get a president or any sort of leader who does not attempt to, for lack of a better term, manipulate us via, let's say, social media? Is that where we are right now, where it's not the stump speech so much as the tweet?
Yeah, I'm not sure we will. I mean, until a new technology comes along that they take advantage of as well. I just wrote an essay and talking about how Silicon Valley's changed, from the double E's to the code writers and et cetera. And one of the things I talked about was freeware, which we all love, you can get it for free. You just download it, is actually a truly pernicious Valley invention because, you give away everything free, but you don't really notice that you're giving up every bit of your personal information. So you're slowly surrendering your liberty in order to get that, that new widget or something. And we're going to have to peel that back. We're going to have to have more daylight into the process. It may be that ultimately we own our data. And if, some company wants our data, they have to buy it from us, maybe through a broker or something else. Or we may just say, here, take all my personal information as long as I can have that, new version of World of Warcraft. But it has to be our decision. Right now, it's not really our decision. And I think that's where a lot of the resentment of the Valley is coming from right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's about the data. Maybe there's a job opening or a whole career opening with, after all, there are agents to handle your book deals. There are agents to handle contracts and whatever jobs we have. Why not an agent to handle our data? Perhaps?
Yeah, my 25 cents an hour for the original. Yeah. One of the numbers I put, they asked me to do the 5 numbers. The one I put, but it really didn't work, was nothing. And that was the number attached to how much money did Doubleday make publishing my book. So I hope Stripe's done such a beautiful job of packaging and binding and all that. I hope they actually see something from this, because I
I
figured when I
understand.
finished, I could have put on a paper hat and worked at the window of McDonald's and made more money writing my first book.
Well, I'm glad you did, and I'm glad we got to talk about it. I want to make sure to get to some questions out there, and some have filed in via the comments. And by the way, feel free to put them either in the Q&A section or the comment section. I'm monitoring both. From Atushi, Mike, this is something we touched on earlier, but should Silicon Valley work closely with China? What about intellectual property issues, human rights issues, which are kind of on two other sides? What should we be doing about China right now?
Oh, that's a really complicated question, because is China still a friend or is it an enemy? And if you're making Apple computers, and Nike's a few miles away from where the Uyghurs are being, imprisoned in concentration camps, how do you justify doing that just to make profits? There was a incredible article written, I think 1980, 1979, in the Computer Decisions magazine, one of these trade things that disappeared, by a guy named Hesh Wiener. And I've always remembered it because the title of it was, "Would You Sell a Computer to Hitler?" And he went through the list of all the companies. I was working at HP at the time in PR, all the companies that were selling mainframes and mini computers to the likes of the Argentinian government and to other dangerous companies and countries and enemies around the world, who were doing terrible things like keeping track of citizens that they were arresting. And nobody talked about it. And the question is, are we in bed with China at a time that it's not morally right to be there anymore? I mean, I was all involved in that intellectual property thing where China was stealing everything, but they made some moves to try to, they joined the World Patent Organization and all that kind of stuff, but they're still doing it. I know companies. I've been involved in companies where they actually put in tripwires into their products that they were going to sell to China, in case they try to reverse engineer the code, it would just scramble it. I mean, that's when you're dealing with a country that allows that kind of theft, you got to think twice.
And I
I think,
believe
yeah,
IBM did sell computers to Hitler during World
yes,
War.
yeah,
That
exactly.
happened.
Yes, they did. And so the question is, at what point is it just morally wrong to be dealing with China? I mean, we are so deep in right now. I mean, we have the institutes at our universities. We have the top basketball player in the world kowtowing there. We have a famous WWE wrestler who's now a movie star. He's apologizing for his scene. They're reworking Hollywood movies not to anger China. On and on and on. When does that stop? And when do we say that market is not worth it? I mean, they're threatening Taiwan, the source of most of the chips in the world. And they just threaten. They say, well, if you try to defend Taiwan, Japan, we have nuclear weapons. We're getting into very dangerous ground here. And I think companies are going to have to make some very serious decisions very soon.
Catherine Ree has a question. She wants to know your thoughts on the new semiconductor facilities. This is something you've talked about on your podcast, Intel, TSMC, et cetera, getting built in Arizona, where, much like California, there are constraints on water, energy, other environmental challenges. So you just talked about some of the geopolitical concerns about technology's growth and expansion. What about concerns about the environment, especially when it comes to things like water?
Yeah, I think they're built. When they announced they were going to build down there, I thought, well, that's, why there? And then you realize, well, but Moto and Intel have been there for decades. And so you have a large population of people that are pretty good at putting on the bunny suits and doing the fab stuff. And so when you've got a body of trained people, you're going to go there. You're not going to go to Dubuque, or Enid, Oklahoma, or something like that and start over. You're going to start where you've already got an installed base. I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on the infrastructure of Arizona and New Mexico, but there you go.
I mean, environmental concerns are haunting, I would say, the likes of Elon Musk when he talks up Bitcoin.
Yes.
While he's simultaneously building cards that are better for the environment, he's talking up a currency where a lot of the mining gets done at the expense of the environment. this is.
Did you ever, you're in 2021 when people are concerned about the environmental damage created by a cryptocurrency. I never thought I'd see that day. Yeah, no, I didn't predict that one.
Right. One thing you touched on earlier, antitrust, and from Riho or Rijo, I apologize, Riho Simon, if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but the relationship between Silicon Valley and DC, where do you see these antitrust hearings go? Is it ever going to, impact the Valley? Is it ever going to make a difference in what the likes of Facebook and Uber and Amazon, not to mention Apple and Microsoft, is it ever going to affect any of these companies whatsoever?
I think at some point it does. We've watched this kabuki dance now for years, and Washington, D.C. says we got to do something about big tech, and then big tech sends their army of lawyers and everything else back to D.C. They're lobbyists, and they write big checks, and everything gets quiet again. I think that though there is a rising anger about what's going on, and that these guys have too much power and too much influence on our daily lives, we're starting to see noises. At some point, no matter how much money a congressman gets, he's got to vote a certain way for his constituents. I see that day coming. It's interesting because I don't think it's breaking up companies after at a certain point is not a bad thing. Ultimately, the pieces of that company are usually more successful than the original company. And the classic example of that is IBM. I mean, IBM was truly a monopoly, crushing Burroughs and Univac and all that with their mainframes in the 50s and 60s. Then all of a sudden they get hit by antitrust. They're paralyzed with legal hearings for almost a decade. In that time, they didn't get into the personal computer world. And they, kind of left mini computers, but they really missed the personal computer revolution first round. And that enabled 150 companies to get started and Apple to rise up and Commodore and a few others. Well, then IBM gets in the game with, Boca down there in Boca designing the IBM PC, and they come in and they eventually take over a sizable share of the market, but the companies that got created while they were distracted are now giant too. So we have real competition, we have real innovation. And I think the same thing will happen right now. Where do you go? If to communicate, you go to Twitter. You go, if you want to put your vacation photos up, where do you go? You go Facebook. You don't have really any choice. If you break them up, you're going to have multiple companies filled with a lot of the same people. But now running those companies, and you have a lot more competition, a lot more innovation, a lot more creativity, and you have a lot more dynamic because entrepreneurs start showing up again in that field. Right now, those markets are closed.
It wasn't that long ago we had spin-offs from large companies. That's how we got Lucent. That's how we got Agilent, the medical technology. And yet now it just seems like everybody wants to show how big they are.
Yes.
Isn't that ultimately, historically, an unhealthy trend?
A very unhealthy trend. If you look at the history of the Valley since 1960, look at the leading companies every 10 years. They pretty much completely changed every decade. You might have one left like HP or something, but the rest of them changed every decade. Lately, that isn't the case. We have companies now that are 20, 30 years old that are still dominating everything. And that is not healthy. Maybe it's healthy for our balance of trade, but it's not healthy for the economy. It's not healthy for Silicon Valley.
All right, we have time for a couple more questions. One just came in. Let's see, Mike, what advice do you have for people who want to take a more active role in tech to help shape a better future in their personal lives or even for humanity? And that's interesting because tech talks a lot about, hey, we're really helping humanity. We've talked a little bit about how that's kind of sketchy, but even a better future for themselves, and their fellow people. What can they do?
That's a tough one. Well, one of them is, there are always brilliant people out there. There aren't a lot of, let's put it this way. There's been only like 4 geniuses in Valley history, right? I mean, there's Herney, there's Bill Hewlett, amazingly, when he was a college kid, was, and, that's about it. Oh, and Bob Weiler, the legendary drunken, crazy brilliant Bob Wilder, but there are very, very many brilliant people around here. I mean, this is, the IQ of Silicon Valley is insanely high. There's always people that want to try something new. They want to create a new company. Um, they're out there and they're looking for help. They're looking for people that'll step in and join them and, you know, give, all of their energy to making a new technology work, a new company happen, and network, get to know people out there. One of the great rules of Silicon Valley is if you can't answer somebody's question, you refer them to somebody that can. And that's been the dynamo of this town, is that you will get connected to everybody in this town in 3 or 4 or 5 steps. And form startup teams, develop products of your own, and influence the creation of those companies so that they are enlightened. I mean, it's a sad thing that the most enlightened company in Valley history was at its peak in 1958. I mean, that was Hewlett-Packard. There's never been a more enlightened, better run company in the Valley story, especially a big company. HP's not even HP anymore. And where are the people taking risks on organization and treatment of employees and that sort of thing? The internet is the ultimate platform for communicating with other people. Start a blog, make your case for what you believe in, and get involved in crowdsourcing things. If you see a project, a new company or a new product that you think will help mankind, get involved with that. There's a million opportunities to do good in this town. We tend to just focus on doing well, but get involved. I mean, I've been a Boy Scout leader for 20 plus years. That's important to me. Okay. I should say scouts now because we have girls. That's important to me. That's my way of helping out the community. Nonprofits in Silicon Valley are desperate for people because everybody works 80 hours a week. So they're not really free to devote a lot of time to charity. Do so. Help out. Make this a better place.
Excellent. So we've got our final question all teed up, but one quick one because he wrote in early with something very specific that's going to take you back. David Fraden says, "Hi, Mike. I think I filled your position in HPPR. What did you do there?"
What did I do? That was interesting. I was in corporate PR and I handled the core, APD, which is where Woz was working, which is calculators. In fact, one of the questions you were thinking about asking me, what was my favorite artifact in the museum? It's actually Noyce's journal. I think that's the document of Silicon Valley. But there's several HP calculators that are in the storage room that I introduced. So that, I was corporate PR. I held the calculator group, the desktop computer group, and part of the mini computer group. So I was there for the second and third introduction of the HP 3000, which kept screwing up. And I also introduced, and I'm proud to be wearing a Fitbit. I introduced the HP01 digital watch, which is like going for $10,000 now. It weighed about a pound, and you had to have your shirt cuffs let out, but it was really the first true computer watch.
That also gave you biceps just by virtue of.
Oh yeah, one arm got longer over time.
All right, I'm going to wrap with this from the Computer History Museum. Mike, this has been a great trip back and into the future. So we'll end with kind of a future question about what the museum wants you to do. The museum committed to inspiring the next generation. There is a one-word initiative that focuses on one word of advice to a young person starting their career. So as you reflect on your life, your experience here in Silicon Valley, we want to know your one word of advice as well as the story behind why you chose that one word.
Okay. I've watched a lot of people at the museum hold up their word, and they're always uplifting and positive. And, I always feel good looking at them. But I thought, no, I'm going to tell the truth. Relentless. This valley was built by and run by and will continue to thrive as a result of people who are relentless in their pursuit of great technology, great companies, success. You can't change the world if you're not relentless. You can never give up. Uh, when I had a TV show on PBS, I interviewed a bunch of executives and I said, "What was your single biggest screw up?" And it was interesting. The most successful people were the ones that were most willing to admit where they had failed, and they had used that as a goad for ever since. It was like a shiny object they kept in their pocket and polished all the time to remind them, never give up. Keep going, keep trying. It will work eventually. You will win in this town if you work hard enough, long enough, and you stay relentless. Just never give up.
And I like that advice stays the same throughout the decades. That's
yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, Michael, as always, great to talk to you. I look forward to hitting your podcast again this Friday.
Silicon Insider podcast every Friday.
And thank you to the Computer History Museum for letting us chat. This has been great. I know I speak for Mike when I say we're both big fans of the museum and everything you guys do. So thank you. And I will turn this back over to Daniel.
Well, my goodness. Thank you both. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Mike, for your book. You said a few things early in the conversation that stuck with me. You talked about rock stars and you talked about things emerging in the 1980s, which made me think about here we are sort of once in a lifetime and same as it ever was. It made me think about Talking Heads because here's where we are. We're on a camera. We're using the technology that was demonstrated so long ago by Engelbart, and we're presenting context and history and the ability to think deeply about the stories of the past and how they can be a guide for thinking about the future. It's a wonderful opportunity to reflect, and I encourage those who haven't to take a look at the book. There's some incredible stories. It's about the people and the implications. And so with that, I'll encourage those who have been supporting the museum to take your hats off and thank yourselves in support of us coming out of the pandemic. We've done well relative to anyone else. I feel really good about our position, but those who haven't supported the museum, I'll encourage you to take a look at our website and do what you can do to help us. If you like programs like this, keeping them alive is super important. So as Marguerite said, we'll be moving on to some in-present opportunities at the museum in the not too distant future. But let me once again thank Scott and Mike for a wonderful program today, and you, our audience members, for giving us your time and support. So thanks again from CHM.